Today we're going to compare the cameras on our Nothing 2 phone versus the iPhone 14 Pro. Now one thing to note is that there's 4K on the front facing camera for the iPhone, whereas on the Nothing 2 the max you can do is 1080p 60. Right now I am heading down to LA, so a lot of these camera samples will be about my trip. Alright, this is an unfair comparison because the Nothing 2 is more of a mid-tier phone at around $600, whereas on the iPhone 14 Pro is at $1,000. But the Nothing 2 phone just came out and it does have some hype over it, and I did test it out by itself, just shooting it around and just testing the camera, and it is pretty good. Now that I'm putting it next to the iPhone 14 Pro, there are some differences, and for the most part, the Nothing 2 phone is pretty consistent with its photos, but just not as consistent as the iPhone 14 Pro. Like the HDR, sometimes the brightness can be just almost overexposed and the shadows can be darker. And then there's the colors. I would say the iPhone usually have this yellowish greenish hue over it, whereas the Nothing 2 phone does sometimes look more saturated or more natural. But going back to just like HDR, sometimes it can be inconsistent, especially when you're indoors where it's a lot of tungsten lighting. It can be super yellow or it can be super green. So that's one thing to note when I'm looking at these photos, is that the iPhone is consistent throughout the coloring, the HDR, so nothing really stands out. So you always expect what you always know how the iPhone performs. Versus the Nothing 2 phone, maybe like out of the 10 photos, one of them might be off. Now moving on to the other noticeable differences is the ultra wide. The iPhone 14 Pro is definitely wider, so if you like to shoot ultra wide pictures or if you're in tight spaces, that ultra wide is going to be a lot more useful than the one on Nothings. And then there's the telephoto pictures where the iPhone does have its own dedicated lens, so of course zooming in will look much more clearer. Now, not everyone uses a telephoto lens or needs to zoom in, so for the most part, if you're just zooming in a little bit like the 2x, you should be fine with the digital zoom. Now, if you need to zoom in and you want the best quality, then you have to get a phone with a telephoto lens. Now, even comparing the low light pictures, the Nothing 2 phone doesn't seem too far off. You can see some huge differences like with the HDR or the bright lights, but for the most part, the pricing on the Nothing 2 phone performs pretty good compared to the iPhone. Now, how about the performance? Well, during daytime, both of them performs pretty smoothly. During nighttime, the iPhone still performs smoothly, but the Nothing 2 phone, you will feel the phone being not as responsive when you're taking photos. Since I'm taking a photo right next to an iPhone, of course I can see the difference, I can feel the difference. But if you're just taking it alone with the Nothing 2 phone, for the most part, you should be fine. For the portrait mode experience, the iPhone is going to be the winner here. You can shoot from 1x, 2x, and 3x, whereas on a Nothing 2 phone, you're only stuck with the 1x. For the colors in HDR, I do like the iPhone much better. A lot of things pop more, like the greens, my skin. I'm even more brighter or more exposed than the Nothing 2 phone, where I do look a bit more stale and darker. Now moving on to video, we know the ultra wide is a lot wider on the iPhone, so when you're in tighter spaces or you want the epic shot, it just looks a lot better, you can capture a lot more. The iPhone does have a more HDR look with the more exposed shadows, and the highlights does seem more controlled. And then moving on to the stabilization on both the ultra wide and wide, you can see a lot more micro jitters on a Nothing 2 phone whenever I take a step on the floor. It is a lot less noticeable on the wide lens, but you can still see it from time to time. And then moving on to low light, both the ultra wide and wide, clearly the iPhone is going to be the winner here, just because with the stabilization alone during daytime, it does get a lot more worse during the nighttime. So I would say the Nothing 2 phone is pretty good for the amount of money you're paying for just for photos. For video, it does pretty decent, but I am putting it next to a flagship phone that performs one of the best for video. So that is the comparison between these two phones. Let me know your thoughts about the Nothing 2 phone, and is it worth the price for you? Also, if you want to check out the Nothing 2 camera experience, I do have a video on that as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.